In this video, I will cover clothing and textiles regulations in the UK. And before we begin, I just want to mention that this serves as a broad introduction to this topic. I will not cover every single requirement that can apply one way or another to clothing or other textile products. And I also want to mention that this video only covers requirements in England, Wales, and Scotland, so not Northern Ireland. So when I say clothing or textile products, what I'm referring to is the following. So we've got clothing that's not for children specifically, home textiles like blankets, could also be curtains and so on, children's clothing, and protective clothing. And this is regulated in different ways. Now, some regulations apply to all textile products, or at least most textile products. And that's why we begin with the labeling regulation and also the REACH regulation. And then we look into the GPSR 2005 standards and the PPE regulation that only covers some types of textile products. Right, so let's begin. So first we have the textile fiber labeling regulation. It's based on an EU regulation, but this refers to the UK version or the retained version or the assimilated version. In any case, it's quite straightforward in the sense that it requires you to affix the name of the fiber. So that could be cotton, it could be polyester, or a blend, and this is normally on the item itself. And you must also use these specific names that you find in Annex 1 of this regulation. So cotton must be called cotton, and polyester must be called polyester, and so on. The second, we have UK REACH, and UK REACH also applies to broadly all consumer products sold in the UK, including clothing and textile products. And what the UK REACH does is that it sets restrictions on chemicals like phthalates, including DHP, lead, cadmium, mercury, and so on. So essentially, the fabrics or buttons, zippers, and so on cannot contain restricted substances above the set limits. And if a component does contain a substance above the limit, then you cannot sell it, at least if it's under Annex 17. And normally you have to go to a third-party testing company like it could be Intertek, SGS, TV, Rhineland, to verify if a certain fabric or a component contains substances above the set limits. Now, when it comes to determining the specific substance list, because for context, it's just 4 substances right here, but under Annex 17 are hundreds of different chemicals, and unless you are a chemical engineer, when you're specialized in textiles, you cannot make this assessment. You cannot determine what are the specific risk substances that could be in, say, a coated polyester fabric. Luckily, you don't actually have to do that. You go to a testing company like the ones I mentioned, and they can then determine what tests are, let's say, necessary, which in turn depends on the material. Right. Now we have the GPSR 2005 that should not be confused should not be mixed up with the EU GPSR from 2024. That being said, they are very similar. I would say that the core principle is really the same. Now, what the GPSR 2005 states is that all products sold in the UK must be safe. All consumer products sold in the UK must be safe. And the way we define safety, or the way safety is defined, really depends on the product. Now, if we have something like children's clothing, like you can see this baby romper, then safety would likely be defined in terms of the presence or hopefully non-presence of small parts, drawstrings that are too long and could cause let's say, a strangulation risk or flammability. When it comes to home textiles, that like curtains, then perhaps we're primarily concerned with the flammability risk. In order to comply with the GPSR, the best way and the expected way is that you identify product standards. These could be referenced under the GPSR 2005, but it could also be non-reference standards. But essentially, it's up to you as a producer, which could be a manufacturer or importer, to ensure that you follow some sort of safety criteria, which is usually defined under product standards, which I will get to in a bit. Now, other than that, you also have labeling requirements. Your company name and address, product name, batch number, warnings and instructions when necessary. Now, keep in mind that warnings and instructions are only, let's say, a complement. They do not serve as a substitute or replacement for actually selling a compliant and safe product. And finally, testing is necessary. As I mentioned, compliance requires that you identify one or more standard for your product, and it can be more than one. Now, when it comes to clothing and textile products, as you can see here, there are a few that apply specifically to children's clothing. But as you can see, there's also some that apply to beddings. Okay. So your job is now to go to knowledge.bsigroup.com and identify the standards that apply. And I suggest that you type in a keyword that sort of describes your product. As you can see here, if you sell children's clothing, search for children's clothing or children's nightwear, and you will likely find a number of standards that could potentially apply. And finally, we have the PPE regulation 2016-425, which is also based on the EU PPE regulation. But again, this is the UK version, the assimilated version. There could be differences as they may be amended and go in different directions. But anyway, in short, the PPE regulation applies to PPE, and that also includes protective clothing. Could be workwear, gloves, safety vests, like the one you see on the right. And ensuring compliance is very similar to the GPSR 2005, based on compliance with designated standards. Okay. So in short, you have to identify one or more standards that apply to the product, and then you have to ensure that your product is compliant, which means that you have to likely buy the standard and make sure that you um, comply with the different safety provisions and so on. I could imagine that when it comes to safety vests, you need to make sure that the uh, reflective tape must be of a certain size and maybe of a certain type and so on. So they tend to be quite specific, sort of like blueprints that apply to specific products. 3, you also need documentation. This is generally issued by the manufacturer. That's a declaration of conformity, technical documentation, user instructions when necessary, and also test reports. And a test report is essentially a document that demonstrates that a product was tested according to one or more standards. In this case, that would be a PPE designated standard, and thus verifies compliance. The regulation also comes with certain labeling requirements. Either apply UKCA or CE marking, and traceability and warning and instructions. And as I mentioned, this is the UK version, so it's best that you go to the legislation.gov.uk to find the requirements.